Good afternoon and welcome to the final video in our response series to the Post-Pandemic Future of Homeschooling Conference hosted by Harvard Kennedy School. If you've seen our other videos, this is the final week. They've been doing this for 7 weeks, and if you haven't seen our other videos, you can find them on our YouTube channel and on our website, and we encourage you to check those out. You can find Homeschool Freedom on Facebook and Instagram, and we encourage you to join the conversation. So my name is Tara Bentley, and I am the Executive Director for the Indiana Association of Home Educators. I have 2 daughters, both homeschool graduates, and our organization has been serving Indiana homeschoolers since 1983. We're here today with other state leaders. We're a part of a national network of state organizations, and Homeschool Freedom is a project of the Alliance, a network of Christian homeschool organizations across the United States and Canada. And today I'm joined by 3 other state leaders, and I think we've got covered like coast to coast, right? So we have Jen Snyder with Homeschool New York, Ginny Urich with the Michigan Christian Homeschool Network, who's literally on the coast up in Michigan today, and Rebecca Kosas with the Christian Home Educators Association of California. So welcome, ladies. I'm so glad that you're all with me.
Thanks for having us, Tara.
Hi, Tara. Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
I think we all wish we were on the beach with Ginny today. But
yes, I've got a good background, that's for sure.
You do. So we just got done watching today's session with the Harvard panel, and they had 5 homeschool parents, and also they had a moderator who is also a homeschool dad and has been a homeschool researcher. And it was a very informative panel. It was basically, the topic was parents' experiences with homeschooling, which is pretty broad. And I think we also walked away, we all learned some things. And I'm going to start with one thing. And I think that there is that myth that homeschoolers are all the same, that we all come from the same place and the same experiences. So that panel certainly did not all come from the same place. So I'd love for you guys each to share a little bit about your own homeschool journey and how you got started. And we'll start with Ginny.
All right. Well, we initially started homeschooling solely for the sake of time. Full day kindergarten swept through the year that we got pregnant with our first, and the bus came at 8 a.m. and didn't get home until 4:45. And it just didn't seem like that would help, a whole child. They're too tired, and it's just a really long day to be away from home and siblings and mom. And so that's why we started. I was a high school teacher, so I have an education background. And everyone always says, oh, well, that helps you with homeschooling, but truly it does not. It helps. It helped me to know how to manage a classroom of kids who didn't want to do any math. That's what I taught, and kind of move them through sort of in an assembly line fashion. But home education is just, like you said, it's so diverse, and every family does it a little bit differently, but that's the beauty. And so now we have just like the longest list ever, right, of reasons that we home educate. And, it's good for kids socially and emotionally and academically. It just helps them thrive. And so we've had 4 more kids since that first one. They're ages 4 to 12. And we just kind of do a mix of approaches and just are very confident that the kids are learning through living.
And before we go to someone else, I want to say, so Ginny is outside, and we talk about the fact that we don't all homeschool the same way. And I know that, Ginny, so your approach is definitely outdoors. You are a blogger. Talk a little bit about what you do.
So I'm the founder of a global movement. It's called 1,000 Hours Outside, which is as simple as it sounds, but very profoundly impactful. We are aiming to spend 1,000 hours outside every calendar year. And for us, that is the foundation for our homeschool, because complex movements and fresh air and all of those things, even the sunlight helps our eyesight, helps us to read better. And so all of that helps our children, and it helps us as parents as well. And so that's a portion of what we do as a homeschooling family.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, Jen, what about you?
So I'm proof that God has a sense of humor, because when I was 17, I was a freshman in college and I met Rob, who is now my husband. And we were involved in a campus ministry. And the staff member that was the representative for both our campuses was homeschooling their young children. And, Rob had told me about that and never had heard of homeschooling, never had heard of anybody doing it. And I remember this moment like it was yesterday, where I just put my hand on my hip at 17 going, oh, that's ridiculous. Why would you do something like that? I went to public school and I turned out okay. And it's a good education. And that's overreactive. That's just too protective. So fast forward 8 years, and now I'm 25 and I have my first kid. And as we're getting to know people and we're listening to things about homeschooling, just kind of in the periphery, but knowing by the time he turned 5, we really don't want to participate in the public school. We want Christian education. And so I ended up having 2 boys at that point, and we put them in a local private Christian school that was associated with a church that we had friends in. So we felt very comfortable about the environment. And, very similar to one of the panelists today, my oldest hated school from day one. He just was not happy. He just acted out. He was a smart kid. He read early. He could do all the work. He just was always a problem. He just didn't want to be there. And it got progressively worse as he went from 2nd to 3rd to 4th grade. And I really was beside myself, not knowing what to do with him. And in that moment, there were a couple of problems in the school. And so we were faced with a decision to pull them out. And we went looking at every other Christian school we could in the area. And because of what was going on in our life, I was pregnant with my 3rd child. I would have had to drive them to any other school that we picked. And most of them were 20 or more miles away from our house. And I just knew that wasn't going to work. And then our younger son, who was 2 years younger, was capable of doing schoolwork way beyond his grade level. And so I had this kind of mix of one who hates school and one who's just not being challenged. And what do I do with them? And I had started over like a 6-month period, just researching homeschooling. What's it about? What would it look like? I finally met one family that I interacted with, and can I just come to your house and observe you? And she thought that was the weirdest thing. And she's like, oh no, you would do this, you would do this. So I feel like we made the decision to homeschool in a vacuum. I was really resistant to it, but my husband was supportive. And I just kind of kept saying, no, there's no way. I'm not organized enough. I wouldn't keep up with things and I don't have the time. And he would keep track of what we were doing on the calendar when we were at school. He would say, well, what would you do today? And I was a very active parent. So I'd be cooking hot lunch, or I'd be at the book fair, or I would be on a field trip. And he would write those hours on the calendar and just say, hey, if you were homeschooling, you'd have those hours back. And so by the time push came to shove, we realized that we really had no other choice. We had to bring them both home because their unique needs were just not going to be met in a school setting. And it turned our family life around. We were also struggling with the outside of the house activities, baseball, soccer, and that sucked up a lot of time. And soccer and homework sucked up a lot of time. And then I worked on the weekends. And so our family life was suffering in the middle of all that too. And so this just kind of became a way to fix those issues in one thing. And I really do wish that I had just done it from the beginning. And now I have 2 more girls, so they've just been homeschooled right from the start, never knew any brick and mortar school. And it saved our family life. I'm happy to say that my older son, while we still kind of struggled while we found our rhythm for homeschooling, we did try the school at home method in the beginning because that's all we knew. And that still wasn't a fit for him. But as time went on and we learned more about learning styles and observing your kids and trying to figure out what makes them tick, I would say it definitely was the best decision we ever made.
And what would you call what style of homeschooling do you fall into?
I would say I'm very eclectic. I think I started out leaning traditional, but not wanting to be fully traditional because I kind of understood that I didn't want to be a textbook driven person. And I didn't want to have like a separate book for every subject. I liked the integrated nature of literature and history and all those kinds of things. So in the end, I became very eclectic. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So Rebecca, what about you?
Well, I would have to say that our homeschool journey was really an extension. Coming to homeschooling was really an extension of our coming to the Lord, because we were married and had 3 kids and then became Christian. Then we were radically saved. And as we were learning what the Bible said about everything in life, how to, family life, how to be married, every aspect of our society, we learned about what the Bible said about education. In the meantime, our children were in public school. And I felt like that was default. If God wanted them to be in our church's day school, we would have been able to afford it, which we weren't. And so that was where God wanted them. In the process of learning what the Bible says about education, I was involved with our kids' school. I was on the PTA, was working with the principal on initiating an anti-drug program, which, as I realized as I read the program from cover to cover, it had absolutely nothing to say about drugs, but it was all about behavior modification and subjective ethics. And realize that these are values that are contrary to what the Bible says. The library books at the kids' school had questionable material in them. They were not allowed to teach about God and actually it was an anti-God environment. It was a great academic environment, but I realized this just is not I don't think this is what God wants us to do. He never did provide for that private Christian education, and he basically showed us that he wanted us to do it. And also concurrently, I saw the effects on our children. Our firstborn was a very type A person and never allowed herself to make a mistake. So she'd be heading off to school with stomach aches because she knew she had a test and she wasn't allowed to miss anything. She just put herself under incredible pressure. And I thought, this is not the way it's supposed to be. Our younger child, who was in kindergarten, was going to be passed on to first grade, even though he really developmentally wasn't ready. And his teacher said, I'm going to put him in first grade, although he will fail because he's not ready to learn to read yet, but he's too tall to stay in kindergarten. Now, granted, right. And so I just said, well, thank you very much. We won't be back next year, and then our little one was really ready to start kindergarten academically, but she was such a small and immature tiny little pipsqueak. I just could not imagine putting this little 30-pounder on a kindergarten playground, So there were so many different reasons, but ultimately it was, as I said, it was a part of our salvation process. It was the next step of God restoring and unifying our family. And we never looked back. We, for a while, said, well, we'll reevaluate every year. And then a few years into it, I just thought, who am I kidding? I know this is what God has for our family. I'm very thankful that we homeschooled. Our methods were very eclectic as well. Very much like Jen, I started out with all kinds of borrowed Bob Jones University Press materials. And then in the process, went to unit studies and then to Charlotte Mason. And by the time we wrapped up with our last of our 5 kids in 2006, I think we had kind of gone full circle back to more of an eclectic, doing a little bit of everything everywhere with our kids. So.
Well, thank you. Yes. So I would say that I was also one of those reluctant homeschoolers. I had no intention whatsoever of homeschooling. I had a friend that I had grown up with in church. We had been in a youth group together, and our oldest kids were born about the same time. And when she said she was going to homeschool her children, you smile and kind of go, that's great for you. I'm like, what are you going to do all day? I don't understand how this is going to work. Because I was ready. My oldest daughter was very social academically. I mean, she was absolutely ready. And so there really wasn't I didn't have any problem putting her on the bus at the time. And by the time she was in 6th grade, she was actually one of the youngest ones in her class because she was a September birthday. And yet she was pretty far ahead of most of her peers. And it kind of just put, this unevenness in her social world. And it's funny to me when people always want to question us about socialization. And I'm just like, well, I went to public school. I did not like that socialization. And it certainly was not a situation where my oldest daughter thrived. We actually decided in her 6th grade year that we were going to homeschool her because she was experiencing some bullying. And I say that with firm knowledge that what my daughter went through as bullying in 2001, I cannot imagine what these children have to deal with. I mean, we hear it, we do hear it, but it's terrifying what some of these children experience bullying in the public school, and that we're being questioned about socialization when we bring our children home to protect them. So it was going to be temporary, totally temporary. We were going to homeschool 7th and 8th grade. I knew that our middle school was not a place I wanted my daughter, but I had no intention of doing high school, none whatsoever. And yet here we are all these years later. My girls are 7 years apart. So my youngest never attended public school. She attended preschool for a little bit. I call her my preschool dropout. So in those 7 years, we definitely tried a little bit of everything. We did exactly what you guys said. Like, we started off very traditional, do the books, textbooks, just like the school. And then very quickly realized this is not the best way to educate your children. So we kind of ended up in that eclectic place as well, which I think is where so many of us end up. Mm-hmm. So in listening to the panel, I just would love to hear from you guys. There were so many great things, great insights, a lot of diversity in their different experiences and their thoughts, which was really good. It was really good to hear that. So let's start with Rebecca. Rebecca, I know we talked a little bit before we started recording, and there were several key quotes or takeaways. What was one of your main takeaways?
Well, I appreciated what Valerie said, that, childhood has an expiration date. She was very much aware of the fact that she had a limited amount of time with her children and wanted to make the most of it. And her goal was to make sure that her children, her desire was that they be able to contribute to their society, which just kind of flies in the face of what so many people think about homeschoolers, is that we're trying to sequester ourselves away from society. But their goal, as in most of ours, we want to raise our children to be, to have a contribution, to be members of, contributing members of their society. So I really appreciated that from Valerie. And I think that that's very common in homeschoolers. We're not thinking just of our children, me, my, and myself, and our own, but we're thinking about the world around us and really having a positive impact on it.
Jen, what was one of your key takeaways?
So I guess, again, Karen's experience spoke to me, and some other things that she pointed out, that not only did going from deschooling to unschooling kind of help her son blossom, but that it also allowed them to solidify the parent-child relationship. And that definitely rang a bell with me, because I really did feel, and this is what kind of led us from going from the more traditional style of education to a little bit more hands-off, was that I really felt that if I had pushed my son in that rigorous academic progression of, the certain level of math and the certain different sciences and certain grades, that by the time he graduated, he would have had the academic, experience. I don't think he would have done well, but I really think I would have lost him. Mm-hmm. And when that realization hit me, I took a step back, and that point, I think, changed our approach to homeschooling. Whereas we started out doing it because we just needed to do something different to our son, to actually seeing it as a way of discipling our children and helping them grow, not just academically, but spiritually and emotionally. And not that we didn't have that as a priority, but it kind of came into our faces a little bit. It was more in the forefront that there was more to this experience than just the academics. And so we tried taking a little bit more of a cooperative approach with him. Like, what is it that you want to study? And if there's a book you want to read, we'll read it together. We'll discuss it together. And I was a little fortunate in that he was older for his grade. His birthday's in April. And in New York, you actually do not have to do any reporting on them if they have already turned 16 by the time they start the next school year. So when his junior year came around, we made that decision to just not report, not to follow the regulations per se, and just kind of let his interests guide him. So we felt that like we didn't necessarily have to accomplish a certain amount of math. Not that we didn't do those things, but the pressure was off to perform a certain amount of material by a certain amount of time. And it was a step of faith in some sense, because I really couldn't guarantee that by the end of high school age that he would get to where he needed to be. But to me, preserving the relationship was more important. And what ended up happening is he discovered a college that he became interested in. I never thought he would go. But he liked the people that he met from there. And he was like, well, I want to be like them. And so if I'm going to go there and succeed, there are some things I need to do. And in his senior year, he just started to take things into his own hands, and things that he would have never performed for me academically. We found outside sources, and I'm not going to say that he passed everything with flying colors, but he applied himself in a way that he never had before. And I think he would have burned out if I had forced him to do that earlier. So I think waiting for him to kind of have that natural motivation, and Karen mentioned that several times about natural learning, and how self-directed learning really is more the natural learning. And so unfortunately, it took me, I want to say 6 years of homeschooling before I understood that not everything had to be scripted and not everything had to come out of a book. And so again, it was a step of faith. It was an experiment. I've done things differently with my other kids, but to certain extents, I have kind of let them self-direct a little bit more. And I have to say it was way more fruitful, and their learning was more meaningful for them because it was what they needed and what they wanted at that time.
Mm-hmm. And when our educational community would say that these kids who are not academic there's something lacking in them, when actually these are hands-on kids that are absolutely gifted in hands-on learning, and gifted in creating things, gifted in building, gifted in fixing. And that's not something that you're going to get in a book or sitting in a classroom. So I just appreciated that from Karen as well. And that was my experience with one of mine who, college was never a good option. And yet God had given him so many gifts to use. So we just look for opportunities for him to develop those gifts so that he could feel successful too, because you're in a situation where you're in a society that's print oriented, and he actually qualified for reading for the blind because of his learning disabilities. But he, and we call it a disability, but we look at all of his abilities that he had. So being able to find those things that he was good at was essential for our young children. I think it's essential for the kids that aren't book, pen, and paper oriented.
I read recently about how, we talk about being right-handed or left-handed, or, the right side of the brain, the left side of the brain, and that actually we can be like right eye dominant or left eye dominant. And then depending on, what culture you live in, that for some people, it's much more natural to read the opposite direction of the print materials. And so if you have a child that's a certain eye dominant, it may take them a lot longer to learn to read from left to right, and so by having them home and offering sort of that individual, each kid is an individual, it really gives them an opportunity to thrive.
Very much.
So Jenny, you were watching from the beach, so you didn't, probably get to write down everyone's names and take notes like the rest of us because you were chilling there. But what else did you hear that was a key takeaway?
I tell you, the thing that struck me the most was right at the end. And I think because it was at the end, there wasn't really an option for people to sort of talk about it further. But there was this comment that these were like the cream of the crop homeschoolers, and that critics might look at them and say, well, of course, these people are going to give good answers. These are the best of the best. But, Dr. Brian Ray from the National Home Education Research Institute, he's got statistics that are representative of the entire homeschool population. So one of the things he says, and this is just one small piece, but he says that homeschoolers score 25 to 30% better academically than their public school peers, regardless of mother's education level. And so, you can have a mother that has a PhD that sends her child to some private school. And, but the statistics are showing that even a mother that hasn't graduated homeschool herself, her kids are, on average going to score 25 to 30% better academically. And it's because it's that individualized instruction. And it's because these are the people who care the most. It's the parents. And so for me, I was a public school teacher, and I got some education. I went to college and I took some courses, and I student taught with a man that was retiring that year, and I don't think he cared too much. When I became part of the homeschooling community, what I see is that this is a group of vibrant families who are constantly learning, who are constantly striving to do the best for their child. You go to these homeschool conferences, there's thousands and thousands of families there, and they're attending these sessions, and they're feverishly taking notes, and they're sharing their experiences with others. This is not emulated in the public schools or with other parents. There's not this sort of quest for knowledge and how can I best teach my child and help my child to thrive. So I do believe that, when you have these couple people that maybe seem like a spokesperson, I do believe that they are representative of almost the entire set of homeschooling families. And I think maybe people don't really realize, you pop into a homeschool conference and you'll see this is vibrant, that these are lifelong learning parents, lifelong learning families. And so it's neat to see that the ones who speak out, the ones that are in the videos, look very similar to all the other homeschooling families.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. So one of the things for me, looking at the variety of the panelists, it also makes me think about the variety of opportunities that these children have had, and just the flexibility. We had people who, one of the reasons they came to this decision was because they were in the military. They needed flexibility. You had the professional opera singer, which I thought was so cool, and she needed the flexibility. You had parents of twice exceptionally gifted children. She needed the flexibility. And it doesn't always have to be flexibility in these big, big ways. My husband worked retail for the majority of our homeschool life. And that meant there was no typical Monday through Friday kind of schedule. And he worked most weekends. And so just the flexibility of being able to homeschool on whatever schedule he was on. And you had more family time that way. And it looks very different. And when Jen talked about wanting to go shadow another family, that is the natural instinct, because we think that our homeschool needs to look like someone else's homeschool, but it's so different. And even down to Douglas, who referred to himself as the unicorn, the homeschool unicorn, the homeschool dad, right? The main home educator, which I thought was funny hearing himself refer to himself that way. But this is the ultimate in flexibility, doing what is best for your child, like private tutoring, right? That's what home education is. Like if you were rich, what would you want for your child? Like a one-on-one tutor. And that's what homeschooling is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that in our particular family, we didn't have twice exceptional children. I didn't sing opera, but each of my children were unique and different. And I'd say we applied that flexibility in, helping them play to their strengths and overcome weaknesses. And so that meant there was no cookie cutter course of study that I moved all of our children through. So, and I think that's another one of the beauties of home education, is being able to have that diverse methodology that's going to fit each and every one of, each of your children individually.
So we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the fact that eventually at some point they had to circle to that age-old question, right? What about friends? Which we all, did everyone roll your eyes when you heard that? Right? Because
yes.
In truth, it was about socialization and friends, and how does that work overall? So Jenny, I know that was something that jumped out at you. I have a feeling your kids have lots of friends.
They do. And guess what? I have lots of friends because of homeschooling. And I think I liked the way that they worded the question, which was, how do you do it as a family? And that is how you do it. You know, yeah, there's certain social times where just one kid or, you know, different experiences, but a lot of the socialization does happen as a family. And I think that's beautiful because it's multi-age, which is, you know, something that a lot of kids really miss out on are those multi-age experiences. But then the whole family gets to join in. I get to join in, and then these become lifelong relationships, not just for second grade or fourth grade. You know, they stand the test of time. So it's unique. It's actually something I wasn't expecting when we started homeschooling. I didn't realize that we would have such good family friendships that came out of our homeschool experience. It's really been very special.
Yeah. You know, what we experienced was, it was a little unique in that there were about 6 or 8 families right here in my housing tract, right in my neighborhood, who were all home educators. And, you know, providentially, we found one another and became a support group, so to speak. And as we talked to our friends about what we were doing with our children and as our families, obviously we were neighbors, so there was a lot of family, you know, family time. The friends would say, oh, I want to join in. And then they would tell their friends and their relatives. And next thing you know, we were bursting at the seams. There was just no way to keep this good thing to ourselves. And so and like you said, you roll our eyes. And I think Douglas said, you know, this is really a dead issue. Because I think when people see your family and your children thriving and your wonderful, you know, cross-generational relationships, they all want to be a part of it. So the goal kept being for us was, you know, not having those relationships encroach upon our actual focused academic time. So, but yeah, it's wonderful. I'm with you, Ginny, just those family, you know, those family, lifelong family friends, that whose kids call you their second mom, and who their kids, you know, we've had their kids live with us. We've had them live with us, or they're building houses, you know, I mean, this is what family does, right? And
it's true community, you know, where I think that, you know, the public school system or even a private school, it feels like community, but really it's not. You know, I mean, I had thousands of students over the years, and I only remember a few of them. You know, but these are families that, you know, you're never going to forget their names. You know all about them. You know, it truly is a real community that you can draw support from, which was one of the things they talked about in that session, which was about support. And I find that we draw support from our relationships. You know, we don't need support from the government. You know, we're drawing that from our community.
Yeah. Yeah. And I found too, you know, my experiences with public school and private school are, you know, you're in a certain grade and you're afraid of the kids who are older than you, and you look down on the kids that are younger than you. And that doesn't happen in homeschooling. So when you have these families together, they mix and mingle, and those inhibitions are gone. And being able to interact with adults, a couple of them emphasized how important it was to them that their kids are good at interacting with adults. And I even find with my own kids, in the same conversation, I'll get somebody who will be complimenting my kids on how well they carry themselves and how they're very personable. And then we'll turn around and go, well, do you worry about socialization? I'm like, you know, don't you see what's going on? And so I see that all the time in our homeschool groups too, that the older kids and the younger kids, they just consider each other friends, and they're very comfortable and they're relaxed, and they look up to the bigger ones, and the bigger ones are protective of the younger ones. And so that disdain that you normally have in that institutional setting is just gone.
Right. That them versus us mentality. Yeah.
So I will add, I think that there is a time and place where you have to be more intentional. And I say that as, you know, the introvert in the room, right? Like, as someone who, when your kids are in public school, some of the socialization is probably more, it's set up for you, right? Like, oh, you have to go do this and you have to go do that. But it doesn't take very long once you find your local homeschool community that you're doing what's best for your children. So you end up, you know, out there. But if you are an introvert, right, and I know labels aside, you may have to put yourself out in these situations. And sometimes you have to be the one to provide those opportunities. If you live in an area maybe where opportunities are not as abundant, you just make it happen. And that's part of what makes our community unique. Like, whatever your child needs, as parents, we step up and we make it happen. And families who, if you have a child inclined towards sports, guess what? You may end up leading a sports organization and you never intended to do it. You may end up leading a support group or a co-op or a book club, or whatever it is. And you have to be intentional. But we're doing what's best for our children. And I know that the one mom who said it, who was it? Karen, who said that, we want the best for our children, because the question was put out there about regulations, and that who are willing to stay home with their children, who are willing to educate their children, they're doing what's best for them. That's a slight paraphrase of what she said. But when you have decided to do this, it's not an easy thing. It's not an easy decision for families to walk away from a free public education down the road. So, but yeah, if you're intentional, there will be more than enough opportunities. And I think one of the things that I heard a speaker say one of my first times at a homeschool convention was, if you're going to call yourself a homeschooler, sometimes you just need to stay home. And it was funny, and it was surprising, because the opportunities are actually super rich and super abundant. And sometimes saying no is actually the hard part.
Yeah. One of the parents pointed out that sometimes there's too much going on. And so, the flip side of that too, and, I had 4 kids, so it's a little easier for me to say this, but sometimes to use the interactions inside the home are just as valuable, because your siblings are forever. And, my experience having attended a public school is my relationship with my siblings is not as close as it is with my children. And I have a 14-year age gap between my oldest and my youngest. And I really cannot imagine that if my olders were out of the house for 6 hours a day at school, 2 hours a day for soccer, and then, working as teens and all that, that they would have the relationship with their younger sisters that they have now. I just don't think that would have been cultivated. But because of the amount of together time that we had in our homeschooling, in our traveling, and just being together more than I think we would have otherwise, I don't think that would have been the same. So the pressure to try and only get those friendships from outside too, I think, you can look for those opportunities and create them, but I don't think you have to try and create them where it's almost impossible. I think that pressure should be taken off of parents, that only the friendships outside the home are the ones that are going to matter.
Right. Okay. Well, there was one final thought that I had grabbed from today's session that I think we'll use to kind of wrap this up. And I didn't get down exactly what she said, but I really enjoyed it. And Valerie, was talking about knowing your why, which I think is something we talk about a lot in homeschool community, homeschool conferences, knowing your why. She also said the what, know the what is the most important thing to you, and remember the who. And I don't know if that was exactly her wording, but I just love that.
Yes.
We talk a lot about why, and then we sometimes talk about what, but to remember the who. I loved that.
Mm-hmm. So when she said that, did you believe she was talking about their, the principles behind homeschooling, and then the what would be the practice? Or I guess, that caught, obviously the alliteration caught my attention as well. I was hoping she would elaborate that on it a little bit more. We know we all have our little who's.
Well, she definitely brought it up as the answer under being asked about regulation. Oh. And so I guess the connection there is, being able to see the reasons that parents homeschool and the fact that they do it differently. And so, regulation sometimes can work opposed to that, I guess, I don't know if that's where she was going, but, there was a lot of talk about supporting families and looking, broadening the idea of education, one of the parents said. And so thinking about how every family is different and how there isn't that one overarching answer that like you have to fulfill these obligations. And so that maybe if you're intentional about your whys and your who's and your whats, you can, you don't need that level of oversight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was a part of the regulation question. It was approaching the end of their time together, so I know that she didn't get to elaborate as much. I do think that she was she even said that she thought her answer might be a little different than the rest of the panelists because academics were probably more important in her household than for some of the others. Because she also said, I understand the impact of not having enough. She talked about being raised in probably a community that was more impoverished, and that being able to meet the needs of her children academically was important. And so for her, the what, to me, I think of, you can apply that in any one of these parents could have applied it in just goals. What are the goals? What's the what in your home education?
Yeah,
So.
I think, yeah, I understand. Now I understand what she's saying. I think, and you're right, some of them might have been just a little bit different from that, but I appreciated Karen talking about the focus of the educational community being on the educational community and not so much the homeschoolers. That we are generally misunderstood by them, which is, how can you take control of a community and a principle and practices that you don't understand in the first place?
Yeah. Well, the overarching theme and title of this, webinar was post-pandemic look at homeschooling. And so to me, that's the biggest eye-opener I think that has come out of the last year and a half, is that when people were not happy with the way the public education system was reacting to the pandemic, a lot of people jumped ship and started to homeschool. So I think that's validation of the fact that it works, that parents can take control, that there were a lot of misconceptions that these parents had about how their children were performing in school, and then having it come into their living room, having it in front of them and realizing, I didn't realize they were learning that. I thought my special ed kids were making more progress in the goals that were set out. And so feeling confident from being exposed, I guess, enough to homeschooling now, that saying, hey, no, I can do this. So I think the pandemic has changed the face of homeschooling. I think it changes some of the language we use. I think people who thought they were homeschooling and said, oh, this is too hard, I don't think they gave it enough time to really experience it in its natural environment, because, one of the parents even pointed out that homeschooling changed for a lot of people during this too. A lot of our stuff was curtailed. So we didn't have the rich experiences that we're used to. And so hopefully that will change. And maybe some of those people will stick it out and learn of all the flexibility and the opportunities that we know have existed up until now.
So I'm going to give any final thought. Jenny, did you have any final thought before we wrap up here?
No, I liked what, you all were saying about, there is just this big difference between home education and public education. And I think that the home educators understand public education, but I don't think that the public education sphere understands home education. And I can say that from, my own personal experience of being a public school educator. And I think that those who have come before, our kids are, middle school and under, have done a fabulous job of paving the way, that the information was out there for me to be able to wait to start, academics. And, and it was out there, like you said, Jen, like for these homeschoolers that are coming up, that they wanted to pull out of that public school system. The support was already there. The systems were already there for them to find their way. And so it's just such a beautiful community. We have been so supported. And I guess my final thought is I'm really thankful. I'm thankful for, the homeschoolers that, have been outspoken over the years and have left their mark and are making it easier for, generations to come.
Wow. Well, that was a pretty amazing final word there, Jenny.
Can't follow that. Nope, that's good.
Well, I would say this has been a very informative 7 weeks. I know that we're, this series is basically wrapping up 15 months of a pandemic. And we know a lot of families are still looking at homeschooling for this next year. And some of them are still in their virtual public schools or other programs. So we're just so glad for this series. It's been informative. Thank you to all three of you as my panelists. And we've had many other leaders who've been part of this conversation for the past 7 weeks. So thank you all. If you're watching today's video and you haven't seen the others, I encourage you to check them out. If you have people who are questioning your decision to homeschool and maybe they're peppering you with questions, I think you can get a lot of answers if you go through some of these videos. It's been a very informative conversation all the way around. So thank you all. And if you want to continue the conversation, I encourage you to pop over to Facebook to our Homeschool Freedom discussion group, and we'll see you there.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.
Thanks, Tara.